Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The Conservative Party federally is in another leadership race, and the vote is coming up in the next, almost two weeks or so. And I've got a gentleman by the name of Andrew Perez joining me tonight. He is a communications expert. He actually worked in communications in the last election for the Ontario Liberal Party, and he's a prolific writer. And he's recently published an article in Policy Options. It's Policy Options magazine. Is that correct?
That's right.
And he's got a great title. Stakes could not be higher for the Conservative Party in this leadership race. The next election will be the CPC's do or die moment. What will the shift away from the center under Pierre Poilievre mean? Pretty provocative title and byline. Andrew Perez, welcome to the show, sir.
Great to be here, Brian.
So tell me a little bit about what you think is going to happen. And obviously, I guess what you think is that this replacement of Erin O'Toole by someone like Pierre Poilievre might actually be a do or die moment for the Conservative Party. Why?
Sure. So I've been following this race very closely over the past 6 months as a writer and someone who's fascinated in Canadian politics. And as I note in my op-ed, it's really been an unprecedented contest from a variety of perspectives. In my piece, I probe three dynamics: the organizational dynamics, ideological, and party unity dynamics. And so when you look at all three, and we can get into this, it's quite unprecedented in what we're seeing. From an organizational standpoint, the party is doing incredibly well. When this contest kicked off in late February, following Mr. O'Toole's ouster, there were only 113,000 paid up members in the party. They now have 675,000, which I believe is a Canadian first. We've never seen a national party with membership tally that high. And so, certainly just from a fundraising perspective and a membership perspective, it's been a huge boon for the party. I obviously don't identify with Mr. Poilievre's vision for the country, but democracy and Canadians joining a party to get involved, whether I agree or not with the platform, is something that I salute. And Mr. Poilievre was able to sign up 312,000 members. So almost half of those members, his campaign signed up from, I believe, a base of about 37,000 donors in the last quarter. So these are really Herculean efforts that they've made, and the results speak for themselves. To give you a sense, Mr. Brown's campaign before he was disqualified claimed that they had signed up 150,000. Those numbers weren't verified, but it's thought that he signed up roughly that amount. And revealingly, Mr. Charest's campaign would not reveal the number of memberships that they had sold. So this is unprecedented. In the 2020 leadership that elected Mr. O'Toole, there were 270,000 members eligible to vote. So well less than half of what we have today. Now, not all those members will vote. It's hard to say how many will. I suspect over 50%, but certainly not a clear majority. This is all quite interesting for democracy. So that's the first piece, and then I can get into the other aspects. Ideologically, obviously the theme, and we've discussed it in the past: populism versus traditional conservatism.
Okay, let's just stay on the organizational for a second, if we could. Some people have contended that really he got a boon from the whole support of the truckers' convoy, and some of the new members are people that came from that trucker convoy and came from all of the donations and the memberships and the emails, etc. What one got from the truckers convoy. In fact, I had one organizer at a funeral dinner that I was regrettably at, who was very involved, who said that it was almost as if the PCP was taking over the Pierre Poilievre campaign, that there were that many people from Maxime Bernier's PCP party and the Trucker Convoy party coming out to rallies and joining up, that it was that kind of populism that was taking over the party. What do you think? Is there any truth to that?
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. I think the strategy has been to go after folks who've never voted before, aren't necessarily traditionally conservative, but feel left behind for a number of different reasons. A lot of probably economic issues. We now, as you know, are facing 40-year record inflation levels, an affordability crisis, a housing crisis. And so, I mean, in the last Ontario election, 42% of people voted. So I think he has been able to tap into disaffected Canadians, those who perhaps have never voted or haven't voted for years. A strong undercurrent of blue collar support is what I'm detecting. And then yes, making a play, making an explicit play for those PPC voters. I think Bernier's party garnered about 5 or 6% support in the last election, something along those lines. Not nearly as high as what had been thought basically a year ago today when we were in the throes of the last federal election. It was thought he might, you know, garner 9 or 10%, but it was enough to make a difference in a few ridings. Even in Ontario, in my hometown of London, I know that the PPC did quite well in a riding like London West, and it may have made the difference because the Liberal candidate won by a couple thousand votes over the Conservative, and I suspect that the Conservative lost support to the PPC. So that's been his strategy. He's certainly not going after red Tories or blue Liberals or middle of the road voters, and so that's a coalition that he's building, and I think that really informs what his strategy will be once he wins this leadership, which he will on September 10th, is building a new coalition, not focusing on the middle. Even Stephen Harper did that in his 10 years in power. So I think that will be very interesting. And then again, where does that leave the Liberal Party? There is that fertile center ground that I think Pierre's people would argue is really dissipating, and that there's really more support to be found among people who don't vote. And then obviously playing to the vaccine mandates politics. I think he's, sadly been very effective in, as you mentioned, the truckers' convoy going into these communities, people who weren't vaccinated, who opposed vaccine mandates, who descended upon Ottawa last February for a month. He's really been able to play to those voters, and I suppose sign up, tens and thousands of members.
We're chatting tonight with Andrew Perez, a communications expert, about the upcoming or the current actual Conservative Party leadership campaign that on September the 10th will announce the results of the balloting process, and an article that he's recently published called "The Stakes Could Not Be Higher for the Conservative Party in this leadership race. The next election will be the CPC's do or die moment. What will the shift away from the center under Pierre Poilievre mean?" We're going to take a break and come back more with Andrew Perez in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm talking tonight with Andrew Perez, a communications expert, someone who was involved in the central organizing campaign for the Ontario Liberal Party in the last election, who's written a really interesting article recently about the Conservative leadership campaign. Andrew, you said that 18 years into its existence as a party, the CPC is at an inflection point. This might sound like a cliche, but after 3 successive losses at the hands of the Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party of Canada, the next election campaign will be a do or die moment for the party. I guess what you're saying really is that the party's got to decide whether it goes to the center, as Erin O'Toole tried to take it, or to the right. But didn't Andrew Scheer take it to the right? And frankly, in the last election campaign that Stephen Harper ran, did he not take it to the right? And did that not succeed? And so, haven't they done this before? Clearly what I guess you're suggesting is that Erin O'Toole's strategy of going to the center, actually, he won the popular vote, so I can't say it didn't work, but it didn't win a majority of seats, and so therefore he didn't didn't even win a plurality of seats, and so therefore he didn't have the right to form a government. But he actually won the popular vote across the country, which is something a lot of people forget. But because of the social conservatives and the people in his party that thought that he had promised he would be more to the right, yet he pivoted to the center, they dethroned him in pretty quick order. So what's the lesson? If Stephen Harper ran to the right and Andrew Scheer ran to the right and both of them lost, and then Erin O'Toole ran to the center and he won the popular vote but got dethroned by his party. What does this all mean for what you think Pierre Poilievre is doing?
Yeah. I think it's a good question, Brian. I think when parties find themselves in opposition for a number of years, this tends to happen sometimes. They try one strategy, it doesn't work. Then they try another strategy, thinking, well, because we tacked to the right, that didn't work. Now we've got to hug the center. I don't know if it's always that simplistic. I think there's, I think Andrew Scheer was probably never going to win that election. The Liberals had been in power for one term at that time, and despite SNC Lavalin, a few other scandals were still quite popular, and Scheer just wasn't able to resonate. And as you allude to, kind of he had that social conservatism that was weighing him down like an albatross, as Peter MacKay said famously. And I actually think O'Toole's strategy as a Liberal was the right one. I've been on the record saying that in my view it's the incorrect lesson from the last election a year ago today for this year ago happening now was to say that, well, O'Toole went to the middle and that's why we lost. I think that O'Toole was actually winning the election for the first 3 weeks. It wasn't until Labor Day when the Liberals kind of woke up from their stupor and went negative on O'Toole, on gun policy, on vaccine mandates, and those critical swing voters in suburban Ontario. The polling was clear that they were uneasy about some of the positions that O'Toole. They didn't think that O'Toole was firm enough on gun control, on vaccine mandates, and by the time O'Toole flip-flopped, it was too late. And so I think that election was winnable for O'Toole, and people were embracing his red Toryism, if I can use that term, but then got nervous on some of those policies that he was still kind of adhering to I think keep the party together.
Like, okay, but then let's talk about that. Then didn't the move to the center actually work in favor of him for the first 3 weeks, as you identified, and it was moving back to the right, or maybe just the Liberals scaring people about the influence of the right Liberals, and the social.
Yeah, it wasn't. O'Toole was not highlighting those policies like on vaccine. Like I think the party refused to reveal whether all their candidates were vaccinated, and he hummed and hawed on vaccine mandates and on gun control. And he wasn't highlighting those areas, but as you say, the media and the Liberal war room pounced around Labor Day once they realized they were losing. And once voters, and I think it really was integral to the Liberals' winning campaign, the political communications they did around guns and vaccine mandates Labor Day onward. So I guess the last 2.5 weeks of the campaign, trotting out, Bill Blair, and they had, effective political, you could say it was all BS what they were saying because, gun crime, I think, has gone up under the Liberal government, but they were very effective in their political communications around the GTA. And so, yeah, I think that that was indicting for Mr. O'Toole. And now Jenny Byrne and the top advisors around Pierre, they've somehow taken from that experience that we need to embrace a more, populist grassroots conservatism. We don't need center-right, traditional red or blue Tories even, or forget about going after the business Liberals. We need to build a new voter coalition that really prizes libertarian, populist, first-time voters, those who were anti-vaccine mandates. And that could, look, I think the next election is really up for grabs. We'll see if Trudeau runs for a fourth mandate. I do tend to think that Trudeau would have a better shot beating Poilievre than any one of his successors, because he is, for all his baggage, he is a tested communicator and very effective campaigner. And I think he is relishing the opportunity to go up against Pierre. And so we'll see what happens. But I think, and I hint at this in the piece, I think that Pierre Poilievre becoming leader might embolden Trudeau to have a conversation with his wife and his family and say, you know what, I'm going to go for a fourth term. My father was prime minister for almost 16 years. He hasn't even reached the 7-year mark yet. So it's not clear what Trudeau would do if he retired right now. He's a young 50-year-old man with who didn't really have a concrete career prior to politics, like many politicians, lawyer, businessman. So I think he's relishing the opportunity. But I'll be interested to see how the Liberals, because they've been quiet this summer and this past spring throughout this leadership race. They haven't entered the fray to frame Mr. Poilievre, and perhaps their thinking is, well, he's not yet leader, and perhaps they've been planning and they'll be executing a campaign or a communications rollout come the fall. So I'll be very interested to see how the Liberals react to Mr. Poilievre's victory and how they begin framing him as an individual and how he would govern the country, because I think they don't have any more time to lose. We don't know when the next election could be triggered. We don't know if this supply and confidence agreement will endure for 3 more years. So I think we're into a new chapter of Canadian politics, and I think it will be fascinating to see Pierre Poilievre go up against Justin Trudeau, because while they do have radically different visions for the country, I do actually see quite a bit of parallels between the two men in terms of
what kind of parallels.
I think so they're career politicians. Neither of them are individuals who had established careers prior to entering politics. I mean, to be fair, Mr. Trudeau was a teacher and did enter the House of Commons a bit later in life, as opposed to Mr. Poilievre, who was elected at 24 years old. But they're both career politicians. They're both extremely politically savvy. I wouldn't say either of them are policy wonks. Their strengths lie in campaigning and political communications and really polarizing the electorate. I would say they're both guilty of that, on the populist right and more the left these days. So I think there's some commonality between the two men in terms of their career arc, their strength, what they bring to the leadership of their respective parties. And so I think it will be quite if Mr. Trudeau does stick around, I think it will be quite a battle royale the next election to see these two men compete, and we can get into it in a bit. But I suspect that Mr. Poilievre is too much outside the mainstream of Canadian politics to be able to win certainly a majority government. I think that would be very problematic for him, particularly in Quebec. I get into that in my piece. There's 10 Quebec Conservative MPs. 7 of them have endorsed Mr. Charest. 2 have remained unaligned, and only 1, Pierre Paul Housse, endorsed Mr. Poilievre. And already one of them, Joel Godin, has publicly mused in the last couple of weeks that he might have to reconsider whether he would remain in the party if Mr. Poilievre wins and doesn't pivot back to the center. So I think, I don't see the party, and I say this in my piece, I don't see the party fracturing immediately. I think there's a risk that he could lose a couple caucus members in Quebec. And certainly the traditional Red Tory, Albany Club kind of old guard wing of the party, to my knowledge, is not going to be actively contributing to his leadership post September 10th.
It sounds like you assume he's going to win. Why has Jean Charest, former leader of the Conservative Party, former premier of Quebec, why hasn't he resonated more? Why hasn't he been more successful in your mind?
It's a great question. It's $1 million question. His campaign, he did not share the number of memberships that he sold. But if you do the math, Mr. Poilievre sold over half of the memberships that are in circulation. And Mr. Brown was clearly in second. And then you have a smattering of other candidates who sold a few thousand. So the numbers just don't seem to be there for Mr. Charest. My understanding is it will be a first ballot victory for Mr. Poilievre. But to answer your question, I think there's a variety of factors. One, and I wouldn't discount this, is, Mr. Charest has been out of politics for 10 years. And during those 10 years, social media was a thing in 2012 when he lost the premiership. But it was pretty limited. It was Facebook. It was a new phenomenon. And so the social media sphere has proliferated over the past decade and has become all encompassing and has become a major factor in election campaigns. I would say, and I wrote about this in Policy Options a year ago, that 2015 was probably the first social media campaign whereby all parties, major parties, invested major dollars into social media, multifaceted social media campaigns, ad buys, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And so all of this took place since Mr. Charest retired from politics in 2012. And so I think from a communications point of view, I do think he's a bit rusty. I mean, I think he would be a tremendous prime minister. I think his public policy expertise and the gravitas that he brings as an individual who was, I believe, the youngest cabinet minister at the time in 1986. I think he was appointed to Mulroney's cabinet and was obviously environment minister in the early 90s, played a pivotal role. And then went on to be, and he doesn't get enough credit for the role he played leading the Progressive Conservative Party when it was just him and Elsie Wayne. That was a thankless job. There was no party status. He was traveling the country, church basement to church basement, and he really held that party together and brought it back from the brink.
Well, I think he held Canada together as Captain Canada in the Quebec referendum.
Right, and that's a whole nother, right. It seems that those contributions aren't, I don't know if it's because a lot of voters now who are young voters, they wouldn't know who Mr. Charest was. A lot of them wouldn't be familiar with the history. And so he likely, is still popular and supported among, for lack of a better term, older Canadians. But Mr. Poilievre, a big part of his campaign has been tapping into the millennial and Gen Z vote, and focusing in on affordability. And he has put out a series of videos recently, and one of them, it's interesting, and there was a Globe and Mail piece on this. It talks about, he's able to take very complex issues and boil them down into layman's terms. And he did a video on marginal effective tax rates, which is an extremely complex issue. And he took the example of a single mother who makes $55,000 a year before taxes with 3 children. And he pointed out that, if her income was to go up by, I think, $1 in both government benefits, but also income, that 80% of that, she would only see 20% of that. 80% of that would either be clawed back by, because she's receiving benefits, or by taxes. And so he approached it from the vantage point of equity, as opposed to the traditional conservative perspective, which would be we need to cut personal income taxes to maintain competitiveness, to be efficient. He's not approaching it from that point of view. He's approaching it from more of an equity point of view, and in the gatekeepers, and we need to go back to basics, and we need to reduce taxes to help you get ahead. And he has another video out where he is eating breakfast and he's speaking without notes, and mentioning the price of bread has gone up 17% in the last year, and the price of milk and eggs. And I think these videos are very, very effective, not among people like you and me, but among more blue collar, for lack of a better term, everyday Canadians who are really, really, really struggling coming out of COVID, with inflation. And people are really, and I'm hearing this even in my network, which is professional white collar class. People are living paycheck to paycheck, and with rising interest rates. And so I think he's really tapped into that. And of course, in my view, he has no solutions. And in fact, he blames Trudeau for inflation. Inflation, actually, I looked at the numbers. Canada has one of the lower rates of inflation right now when compared to other G7 countries. And you talk to an economist, what's causing this are a myriad of factors around supply chains, the war in Ukraine, a number of other policies. And so, but he's pinning it on Trudeau, and that's a simple message, and it resonates with people when they can't make their mortgage payment or pay rent, or are watering down, not being able to buy, nutritious foods for their children. And so I think that message has resonated, and his social media savvy in delivering that message. I haven't seen that, to get back to your question. I haven't seen that from Charest. When he launched his campaign, his video was widely panned. It was not a professional product that he put out. And so I don't know if that's a function of not being able to attract the organizers and the talent, beginning late. I know that Pierre Poilievre was positioning himself for the leadership of this party as early as under Andrew Scheer's leadership. So the last 5 or 6 years, he's been putting out videos. He's been building relationships with grassroots conservatives, building up a talent pool. Seems to me, Charest probably made a fairly last-minute decision to get into this and probably struggled to put together a team. And then again, his own skill set has really been one in government. He has been in government. He was the premier of the second largest province for a decade. He accomplished a lot in public policy terms. He, had an international footprint. This is all fabulous, but that doesn't translate to running a grassroots leadership campaign, whereby really selling memberships is paramount.
We're chatting tonight about the Conservative Party leadership campaign that's ongoing right now. We've got a ballot that's going to be announced, election that's going to be announced on September the 10th. So it's only about 2 weeks away, with Andrew Perez, who's recently written really quite a great article about this campaign. And I love the headline of it, sir. I think it's fantastic. Stakes could not be higher for the Conservative Party in this leadership race. It's a do or die moment. I frankly agree completely. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with Andrew Perez in just 2 minutes. And we're going to focus on populism and whether this is a good trend or a bad trend. And is it something that we've seen before, albeit in the United States and in the UK? Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with Andrew Perez about the Conservative Party nationally, their leadership campaign, and Pierre Poilievre versus Jean Charest. And we've primarily been talking about so far how Poilievre has really resonated and increased the membership dramatically in the Conservative Party, and Charest just seemingly has not done so. But I'd like to turn to your second issue, if I could, Andrew, which you talk about populism overtaking traditional conservatism. And I want to ask you, haven't we seen this before in frankly, I think Preston Manning in Canada and the Reform Party, and it did not work out. And the Reform Party never, was able to elect people east of the Manitoba border. And he really was, I think, my sense is a Western, populist. And almost everything you described about Poilievre, I keep thinking about Trump in 2 elections ago in the United States, where the Democrats didn't think he was going to win, didn't want to describe him because they were hoping that he would win because they thought he would be easier to beat. He really was very populist with his bag of hats and his crowds and his grievance politics. And it worked, and it came close to working twice. And I think Democrats, if not, frankly, everyone was surprised. And Boris Johnson in the UK was similarly a populist. And social media you talk about, and almost being anti the gatekeepers and anti the elite, even though just like Poilievre, he was for a long period of time one of the, he was educated at the top private school in the UK, and he was part of the establishment for a long period of time. And like Poilievre, he talks about not being a gatekeeper and stuff. And as you pointed out, he's been a career politician. He was Stephen Harper's attack dog. So he was keeping the gate stronger than almost anybody during that conservative government. And even Marie Le Pen, populist right wing, appealing to disgruntled people outside of Paris, and losing Paris almost completely, but being able to almost win the country just based on everyone other than Paris and running against the elites. So we've seen this before in other countries. We've seen it in Canada, I think, with Preston Manning. Is it going to work?
So I think it has the potential to, and as you cite in your preamble, we've seen this movie before in several Western countries in the last 5 years. And so I think it's really incumbent upon progressives and centrists to mobilize and to not be arrogant, because, as I said earlier, I very much, while I continue to think that Mr. Poilievre will be very vulnerable in an election campaign because of previous positions that he staked out, which I firmly believe as a Canadian are outside the mainstream. He, for a variety of factors, this government is approaching the 10-year mark. Now we're not going to be into an election this fall, but look at the current situation we're in. An affordability crisis, a housing crisis, mayhem at Canada's largest airports and passport offices. The government not being able to administer basic services like passports, Canadians not being able to, me literally say tomorrow I'm going to jump on an airplane and go somewhere because I don't know what's going to greet me at Pearson. And so I'm hearing it in my networks. There's a sense that the government of Canada, this current government, can't deliver basic services. So the Liberals are going to be vulnerable for a variety of different reasons in the next election. And so I think, as I said earlier, they really need to frame Mr. Poilievre. Now, what I find fascinating about Mr. Poilievre, now you cited Boris Johnson, Marine Le Pen, and Trump. Trump and Marine Le Pen, their populism, well, it involved many different components, but a chief appeal of their populism was nativism and anti-immigrant sentiment. I don't think I told you this in the past, but my father's French from France. Half my family lives in France. And so I'm well aware of how that politics plays and the immense appeal that politics has in France, especially around North African immigration that has been very high over the past 4 decades. And in the US, obviously, with the border and with South America and people coming up through Mexico. Trump, in I think it was the 2016 primary, made that a central part of his appeal. He called, he used very nasty language to frame, refugees and immigrants. He talked about banning Muslim immigration into the United States, and the talking heads and the commentariat thought he was crazy, and there was no way he could win on a message like that. And yet he not only, won the Republican nomination by a landslide, he then went on to win the general election. So, to his credit, Pierre Poilievre has eschewed any semblance of nativism or anti-immigration rhetoric. In fact, I've spoken to people on his campaign, and they've told him that a Poilievre government would maintain, if not increase, immigration levels. That a central strategy around his outreach strategy and membership drive was to attract new Canadians, immigrant Canadians. And so I find that intriguing, and I find that worrisome as a Liberal, because that tells me that that's an area that he's not going to touch. To his credit, I think he recognizes, and his campaign recognizes, that sort of politics is not going to play in Canada. It might have very narrow appeal in regions of the country where Conservatives rack up huge majorities. I note that not in the election campaign a year ago, but in the 2019 campaign, prior to COVID, when it was Maxime Bernier's first campaign as the leader of the People's Party, there was a significant part of his platform that focused on immigration and cutting it dramatically. And that message really had limited appeal. And I think he got less than 2% of the PPC got less than 2% of the popular vote in 2019. And I think it's telling that Bernier kind of learned that lesson, and in 2021 put that aside and doubled down on COVID-19 politics. So that worries me as a Liberal, that Pierre Poilievre has a very savvy strategy around bringing in new Canadians and supporting new Canadians. And so that aspect to his populism is different from Trump and Marine Le Pen. But what's very similar, and I do still think there are parallels between Trump and Poilievre, is this idea around gatekeepers, whatever term you want to use, gatekeepers, elites, this anti-intellectual, anti-elite. Pierre Poilievre wrote a tweet that I found very offensive the other day that said something along the lines of stop allowing the woke control freaks in government, media, and academia control your lives. So he's really playing almost a class politics, going after what he would call government fat cats, the media, the academia, and of course that resonates in a polarized electorate where People are looking at their financial situations. People are looking at their lives. They're not happy, and they're looking to point blame. And who are they going to point blame at? It's easy to point blame at the governor of the Bank of Canada. Well, he has a message for that. I'm going to fire him. You know, to heck with our institutions, and our institutions are not supposed to be political, from government to government. So he and his foray into Bitcoin, to opt out of inflation. It's all nonsense messaging, but it's resonated because of this particular time we live in. And you mentioned Andrew Scheer. Like, I think even 5 years ago, under Andrew Scheer's leadership, these sort of policies wouldn't have resonated. It was prior to COVID. Inflation level, we weren't in the crisis that we are right now in terms of affordability. And so that messaging, it always has some resonance, but not broad mainstream resonance. But because of the particular time we're living in right now, this messaging, I think, increasingly has appeal outside of even traditional conservative voters. In fact, it's often traditional moderate conservative voters who are most offended by this messaging, because conservatism, to my knowledge, was about respect for institution, gradual change, respecting our institutions and our government, and our government. And so
respect for law and order.
Respect for law and order. And we saw, and I know, Marjorie Le Breton, a former senator who has been involved in the conservative movement since the Diefenbaker years, when she worked in Diefenbaker's office. She wrote an op-ed. She was on television speaking about how she doesn't have a home in this party anymore because of the way that Mr. Poilievre managed the convoy, and aligning himself with, there's been a lot of coverage over the last week that he took a photo with Jeremy McKenzie, who's the leader of a far-right extremist group in Canada. Now, his campaign says he didn't know who that was, but I note that the campaign didn't really denunciate this individual as strongly as they should have. And so I think there's calculus is that we don't want to draw more attention to this. We want to return to our kind of anti-elite message. And so I think, to answer your question, there are parallels between Trump and Le Pen, not on immigration, not on nativism. But I think this message that he's put forward is one that, as I say, wouldn't have resonated even 5 years ago. And it's interesting that even someone like Mr. Scheer has strongly endorsed Mr. Poilievre. And so the last thing I wanted to mention, and I mentioned in the column, for those who were around in 1976 and 1983, which I wasn't, it's often said that the old Progressive Conservative Party was synonymous with red Toryism. And I think that's not actually quite true. I think, blue Tories, law and order, free enterprise Tories, played an equally important role in that party historically. And if you look at the 1976 and 1983 leaderships, there were a couple prominent red Tories like Joe Clark, David Crombie, Flora MacDonald. But the remainder of the candidates, and several, John Crosbie and Brian Mulroney and Peter Pocklington and Michael Wilson, were blue Tories who were kind of, putting forth the neoliberalism of that era under Reagan and Thatcher, albeit in a probably in a Canadian context, and so even that part of the party today, I see being completely sidelined. Like the traditional blue Tories that had a major influence even in Harper's government. I see a lot of those people being not comfortable, and I hear people, prominent Tories in the media speaking to this. Someone like Deb Hutton, who was a very senior advisor in the Mike Harris government, spouse to Tim Hudak, played a major role in the Common Sense Revolution. Not a brand of politics that was red Tory by any stretch of the imagination, who said publicly on radio that she is completely uncomfortable with the direction that Mr. Poilievre is taking the party, and that she would not be involved in the party under his leadership. So I find that fascinating too. Again, how populism is beginning to really overtake this party. Like, I don't think that's an exaggeration to point that out. I think the traditional conservatives, whether they're red Tory, blue Tory, even, social conservative, libertarian, I don't see a lot of those voices in this race. I see Even Leslyn Lewis, someone made the point the other day, her leadership bid in 2020, which was actually quite successful, was almost solely based on social conservatism. I think she's recognized in this leadership contest the limit of the appeal of that platform. And she's now branched out in this contest to her detriment and really embraced, conspiracy theories around the World Economic Forum and COVID mandates. She's made that a central plank on her platform and her appeal. And I think that shows, whether she believes it or not, I think that shows that she, in taking the temperature of the membership, realizes that her social conservative message wouldn't be enough to really do well in the race, and that she needs to really go after some of the voters and members that Mr. Poilievre was focused on.
I want to, if we could, spend a little bit more time on this appeal of populism and the impact that it has on the party. And I take your point that Poilievre himself hasn't come out against immigration. But I, in the last little while, I've had the occasion to be in North Battleford, Saskatchewan. So the northern part of Saskatchewan, met several Indian band councils. I interviewed a bunch of Black people, African Canadians in Brampton. And then also I had another occasion where I interviewed several Sikh people from the 905. Each one of them had comparable comments to make about the truck convoy and about the Canadian flag, such that these Indian native band leaders said that they actually had taken the Canadian flag down because the Canadian flag, to them, because of the truck convoy, had become to symbolize a white supremacist flag comparable to the Confederate flag in the United States. And that the cry for freedom was, freedom for me, but not for you. And we don't want you. And I think that came from some of the white supremacist, allegations about the convoy, and then I had, some Black people from Brampton I had an interview with that said, if they had done some of the things in Ottawa that the truck convoy had done, they would have been shot. They would have been arrested. That the latitude, the leniency that had been provided to those protesters wouldn't have been provided. And I had the guy say, look, if I was white with a ball cap on and a hockey jersey on, nothing would have happened to me. But if I was Black and in that protest, it would have all happened. And then similarly, some Sikh people that said that they just weren't welcome in that party. In the last provincial election, I can't even remember the names of the parties, but the New Ontario Party and the Blue Party both had some anti-immigrant policies in their platforms, and often their solution for the affordability crisis that we're currently facing is, well, let's stop immigration, let's stop demand. So while Poilievre may not have that kind of anti-immigrant nativist policy, or at least hasn't spoken about it, the perception in the populace, I think, is that his supporters certainly do.
Yeah.
And that support, just like how a person wearing a MAGA hat that believes in conspiracy theories can end up dramatically influencing the policies of the leader, where the leader goes, because clearly they need the support of those people. The policies of the crowd, of those partisans, of those populists, is going to have impact on Poilievre. And I think that because of that, some people feel uncomfortable. A lot of people feel uncomfortable. In the last provincial election, if you had gone to an all candidates meeting, the read of the room would not have been the read of the election campaign. The read of the room is that the New Ontario Party and the Blue Party and anti-vaxxers were going to win the race. They were the loudest. They were the most present. They were the people that were making the comments. And so, when you think about the people that are having a huge impact on this leadership campaign, sometimes it's the loudest voices that you hear, not necessarily the vast majority of people.
So I'm really glad that you raised those points, Brian, because it allows me to bring up two things I wanted to cover. Number one, yes, and I highlighted it in the opening of this interview, Mr. Poilievre's campaign has, made historic strides in membership sales. There's no doubt about it, and credit to them for that. Now, in a country to your point, in a country of 40 million people in a general election, he says, he signed up 300,000 angry, loud people. How does that translate into a general election campaign? And so, as you say, reading the temperature of this race, I don't think you can translate that to the country at large, because again, this is Conservative Party members, and more broadly, actually looking for new members, often from the fringes. Now, the other thing I wanted to raise, which your question kind of reminded me of, is I think it will be, again, when he is elected leader, because I'm sure he will be, that the Liberals, the war room, really begin framing Mr. Poilievre immediately and reminding Canadians of his record. This is someone who was a partisan pit bull for Stephen Harper for 10 years. He was appointed to cabinet in the dying days of the Harper government in a junior role. He was Minister of Democratic Reform, and his record in that role was abysmal. He brought forward the Fair Elections Act in 2014. And you talk about new Canadian, maybe I gave him too much credit on that front, but he brought forward the Fair Elections Act in 2014, 2015. And that legislation, now my understanding is it was never actually implemented. But that initial legislation that he was a champion for would have made it more difficult, would have imposed much more stringent ID, like proof of ID, when voting. And that would have had adverse impacts on racialized Canadians, on new Canadians, on youth, on people who may identify as transgender. And so, that was his record then. He was also a big defender in the House of Commons and in the media on the whole robocalls scandal that plagued the Harper government for years. He was one of their chief communicators. I don't think he was in cabinet then. When we had the Senate expense scandal involving Senators Mike Duffy and Pamela Wallin and Patrick Brazeau, again, he was trotted out as a partisan pit bull to defend the government. And so his record in government, I mean, he's been in opposition for 7 years, and he can point fingers to all this government's, what he believes are their failings. But his record in government was a pretty weak one. And the other point I wanted to add around new Canadians, and I think, progressive and centrist leader politicians will really need to, bring this back, is in the 2015 election, and you alluded to it earlier, Harper went pretty hard right and was proposing banning the kneecap. And he was proposing a snitch line on barbaric cultural practices. Well, again, Pierre Poilievre was part and parcel of that campaign and that government, and ran on these policies. And so it's all too easy now, 7 years later, to pretend like that didn't happen. And he has tried to embrace new Canadians, but yeah, his record in government is not one that was friendly to racialized or new Canadians. And so I really hope that his political opponents shed some sunlight on that, because I think Canadians and voters need to understand this man's record. This is someone that's been an elected official, in spite of the fact that he's running against gatekeepers and professional politicians. He
was one of them for a long time.
He was eligible for a pension. He's at 31 years old. He's never had a private sector job. Prior to being an elected official, he was a staffer for Stockwell Day. So I do hope that the media and his political opponents are, once he is the leader and the media will be focused, they won't be covering the race anymore. They'll be covering the new leader. That a lot of this light is shed on the man, because I think that Canadians are reasonable people, and a lot of them won't be aware of his record in government, because he was a marginal figure at best. He was a prominent political pit bull, but he wasn't a prominent minister or someone that was really at the centerpiece of the Harper government.
And Perez, this has been a great conversation. This article is an excellent article. People want to read the article. How do they get that?
So it's on IRPP policy options. So you can Google policy options. It's actually the top story on the policy options website right now, which is just a terrific publication that I'm very proud to be affiliated with. And so I do encourage your listeners to take a read, and a lot of there's links, hyperlinks throughout the op-ed to some of the sources where I found my research. And so I think it's a timely time for people to be read if they haven't been following this very interesting leadership race over the past 6 months. It's a great time to tune in. We're in the final days now, and the results will be, most members have voted by now, have mailed in their ballots, but the results will officially be announced on Saturday, September 10th.
We're chatting with Andrew Perez about the Conservative Leadership Campaign. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments. I want to ask Andrew about party unity, and I'm going to actually turn the tables on him and ask him about party unity, not just in the Conservative Party, but in the Liberal Party as well. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Andrew Perez, who's written a really good article, a very well-written article about the Conservative Leadership Campaign. I commend it to you. Andrew, you talk in your third issue that you raised about party unity, and you talk about whether Charest or someone else will create a separate Conservative Party. But let me ask you, you commented about how the Conservative Party historically has been a combination of both blue Tories as well as red Tories. But the Liberal Party also has historically been a collection of Trudeau and Turner, of Chrétien and Martin, of people that were more left and people that were considered more fiscally conservative and more prudent. A lot of people think that the Liberal Party today has gone to the left. And so while Poilievre may take the Conservative Party to the right, Trudeau, a lot of people think, has taken the Liberal Party to the left, particularly given that he's now, maybe some people think, in coalition with the NDP. And is there within the current Liberal Party someone like a Martin or someone like a Turner, someone that is that voice of more fiscal conservatism, more fiscal prudency within a more left-leaning government? Isn't there an opportunity for disunity on both sides? Isn't there an opportunity for Macron or someone like that to come up and create a brand new party in the middle? I interviewed David Crombie, former Tory MP, former mayor of Toronto, who said his party left me. I've interviewed Liberals who say their party has left them. Isn't there a gaping hole in the center?
I believe there is, and I think that I'm an strong advocate for centrist politics and policies in this country, which I believe have gotten away from us in, I would say, the last 7 years. Which raises the point around center-ice conservatives, which I mentioned in my piece. It's an upstart group that started last spring by venture capitalist Rick Peterson, who actually ran in the leadership for the Conservatives in 2017. I followed their work closely. I think they're doing great work. They had a conference in Edmonton a couple of weeks ago, and they're really advocating. They're extremely worried about a polarized political system, and they want a return to centrist conservatism. And I actually think, and I actually tweeted this out to Rick Peterson. I said, maybe you suggest changing your name to just Center Ice, because I think there's a lot of people in the Liberal Party, maybe even former Green Party supporters, other people from other political parties that would support a new centrist party, and maybe center-ice conservatives or center-ice, which makes it a bit more inclusive in terms of attracting people who are disaffected from other parties to get involved with this organization. Now, the Macron situation, and again, I have family in France, pretty unprecedented. That party came about overnight, essentially, and Macron went on to win the 2017 election. I think a result of the old line socialist French party and the old line, what they call les Républicains, which was the party of Jacques Chirac and Nicolas Sarkozy. Those parties by 2017 were extremely unpopular, and they were seen to no longer be effective political vehicles. And so I think there was a once in a lifetime opening there for Mr. Macron to create this party. And he brought in moderate socialists, moderate conservatives. And you saw in last spring, he won his second mandate, the first French president since Jacques Chirac in 2002 to win a second term. Every other president since then had been a one-term president. So what he was able to accomplish is outstanding. Is that applicable to Canada? I wish it was. I'm skeptical. Jean Charest has ruled out creating his own party.
But
I don't.
Andrew Perez and
Yeah,
centrist conservatives might do it. Thank you
yeah,
so much,
yeah.
Andrew, for joining us tonight. What a great conversation. Look forward to sometime having a beer with you and chatting
Great.
about what's happening with the center of the political spectrum and why no one appears to be there. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Check out Andrew Perez on Policy Options Magazine. Good night, everybody.